The thing about Kezia Drummond is that she had been invisible for so long, she had started to use it. Not in the way of someone who had been beaten down and learned to disappear, in the way of someone who had studied the difference between being unseen and being underestimated, and had made a deliberate choice about which one was useful. She was 13 years old and she understood leverage, not as a financial concept, though she was beginning to understand that too, but as a physical truth, a principle. The idea that the right application of force at the right angle could move something 10 times your size, that the world's assumptions about you were a kind of fulcrum. She had been learning this since she was 4. Kezia lived on the second floor of a narrow brick building on the east side of Detroit, in a neighborhood that had its own vocabulary, its own way of measuring time, its own economy of trust, its own specific geography of which corners were fine, and which ones you walked past without stopping. Her grandmother, Estelle Drummond, had lived in this building for 31 years. She had raised 2 children in it, buried 1 husband from it, and watched the neighborhood reorganize itself around her 3 times over. She knew the name of every family on every floor and the birthday of most of their children. She kept a calendar on the kitchen wall with everyone's important dates marked in different colors. Estelle's hands shook in the mornings from the medication. Kezia's never did. She was up by 5 every day to measure the pills and set the glass of water beside the orange juice and leave the breakfast plate warming in the oven before she walked to school. This was not a burden she had been given. It was one she had taken. There was a difference, and Kezia knew it. She had never told anyone at school about any of it. The 5 o'clock mornings, the medication, the way she sometimes sat through third period calculating whether the remaining balance in the household account would cover the utility bill before the next cycle hit. She had learned early that disclosing those things produced 2 responses: pity or judgment, both of which were useless to her. She preferred neither. She preferred information. Her grades were solid but not spectacular. Well, not because she wasn't capable. Her teachers had been noting her unusual analytical intelligence since the 3rd grade, but because she was often tired in a way that the grading system had no category for. Tired in the specific way of children who carry adult weight before adult hours. After school every day, she walked 6 blocks to the NIA Community Center on Mack Avenue, where a former Army combatives instructor named Coach Warren Briggs had been running free training sessions out of a converted storage room for 11 years. Coach Briggs was 53, built like someone who had spent 3 decades taking physical training seriously, with close-cropped gray hair and the particular patience of a man who had seen what the world did to children who had no way to protect themselves and had decided to do something specific about it. Kezia had been his student since the week after her 4th birthday, when her father, a man she had no memory of as a father, only as a departure, had brought her to the center and asked Coach Briggs to teach her. He had said, "She's smarter than she'll be given credit for. Give her something real to hold on to." Then he had left and not come back, and Kezia had stayed. 9 years of Krav Maga and wrestling. 9 years of learning to read a body before it made its move. The shift in weight that telegraphed an attack. The angle of a shoulder that told you where the hand would go. The way balance worked and how to disrupt it. How to neutralize a threat 3 times your size, not with force, but with geometry. She had competed in 3 regional tournaments under a name that was not quite her own, because Coach Briggs had thought it wiser. And she had placed first in 2 of them. Nobody at her school knew. She had never told them. The last thing she wanted was a reputation she'd have to manage. She wanted to be left alone to think. Marcus Holt did not leave anyone alone. He was the property manager for the building on Harrington, the building where Kezia and Estelle lived, along with 42 other families. He was a heavy man in his late 50s who wore short-sleeved dress shirts and kept a file on every tenant, organized by what he knew about them that they didn't want known. He had never once lost an argument with a resident. The reason was simple and unspoken. Everyone knew that losing an argument with Marcus Holt meant a notice on your door and 30 days to find somewhere else to be. Kezia was the only tenant in the building who looked him directly in the face when they spoke. She didn't do it defiantly. It wasn't a performance. She just looked at people directly because that was how she had always engaged with the world. But Marcus Holt had spent 30 years training people to look away, and a 13-year-old girl who didn't was an offense he had been cataloging. Franklin Wells was 61 years old and one of the most quietly powerful men in Michigan. He had made his first significant money in commercial real estate in the early 90s and had spent the 3 decades since deploying it in ways that were largely invisible to the public. He did not attend charity galas or speak at conferences. His name appeared in the business press occasionally and in society coverage almost never. And he wore the same brand of watch he had worn since he was 32. He took the bus when the weather was right. What almost no one knew was that Franklin Wells had been anonymously funding the NIA Community Center on Mack Avenue for 14 years. He had grown up 6 blocks from it. He had not had anything like Coach Briggs when he was young, and he had spent a considerable portion of his adult life trying to quietly correct that absence for other people's children. He walked through this neighborhood several times a year, always alone, always in the evening. His security team had standing objections. He had standing overrides. He knew these streets in a specific and irreplaceable way, and he was not willing to be insulated from them. On the Tuesday evening in November, when everything converged, Kezia was later leaving the center than usual. Coach Briggs had kept her after to talk through something he'd noticed in her training that week, a tightening in her technique that wasn't technical. He had the experience to recognize when a student was carrying something. He didn't press. He just kept her moving, kept her talking obliquely about other things, until the things she was carrying had room to surface. She had told him about the rent increase notice, 40%, effective in 30 days, a number so large relative to what Estelle brought in each month that Kezia had done the math twice because she couldn't accept the result the first time. Coach Briggs had listened without interrupting. When she was done, he said, "That man is trying to make you feel like you have no moves." He paused. "You have moves." Then he told her to go home. She was 3 blocks from the center when she heard it. The alley between Harrington and Crane ran behind a row of commercial buildings and was dark in the specific way of spaces that had never had light installed, because no one who mattered had ever needed to move through them. No cameras. Brick walls on both sides, close enough that sound reflected and amplified. Kezia had her earbuds in, left one slightly broken, working only at a specific angle. She pulled the broken one out automatically, the habit she had of doing it when something at the edge of her perception asked for her full attention. She heard 3 sounds in rapid succession: the impact of something, someone, hitting concrete, the specific sound of a breath compressed by force, not expelled by movement, and then a rhythm that she identified before she consciously named it. Repeated, deliberate, controlled. Someone was being beaten. She knew that sound from one other context, from the hospital waiting room the previous winter when Estelle had been taken in and Kezia had sat on a plastic chair outside a room and heard through a partially open door the sound of a body at its limit. That specific sound, the one that meant there was not much time. She stood at the alley entrance for 4 full seconds. She had already called 911 before she took a step inside. She held the phone to her ear, gave the address twice, stated what she believed was happening, and then put the phone in her jacket pocket with the line still open. She had heard Coach Briggs's voice in her head many times since he first said it. "If you ever have to act, do exactly what is necessary, nothing more, and do not run afterward." Then she walked into the dark. To understand what Kezia Drummond walked into in that alley, you have to go back 72 hours. Marcus Holt had been sitting in his building management office watching the security feed when he received the call he had been anticipating for 3 weeks. The property transaction he had been quietly positioning himself into. 3 adjacent commercial buildings on the east side of Detroit, a package deal that would generate a finder's fee of just over $400,000 for the right intermediary, was stalling. The stall was Franklin Wells. Wells owned a partial interest in one of the 3 buildings, a legacy holding from an acquisition in 2004 that had never been fully consolidated into his main portfolio. And he had been declining to sign the transfer documents for 4 months, for reasons his attorney had communicated as various forms of due diligence, but which Marcus Holt had come to understand as simple disinterest. Wells didn't need the money. He didn't want to sell. And the party on the other side of the transaction needed his signature before any of it moved. Marcus Holt was not a violent man by any internal accounting. He was a man who used information and leverage, and he had done so successfully for 30 years without leaving a mark that was visible in any official record. What he was considering now was simply an extension of that philosophy, the application of a different kind of leverage, the kind that made people reconsider positions they had held comfortably because comfort itself had been removed. He picked up a phone he kept in the second drawer of his desk, not his personal phone, and made a call. The conversation took 8 minutes. The people on the other end asked specific questions. He gave specific answers. He named a route, a time, a physical description. He said, heard him enough that signing becomes the easiest thing he's done in weeks. He did not ask about methods. The pressure on Kezia had begun separately, but with similar calculation. 3 days before the alley, her school had called her into the vice principal's office regarding a formal complaint that had been filed by the parent of another student. A complaint alleging that Kezia had made a threatening statement in the school parking lot the previous Thursday. The complaint was specific enough to be credible. It included a date, a time, a named location. It was also completely fabricated, but it had been submitted through the official district system, which meant it required formal investigation, which meant Kezia now had a documented behavioral flag in her file. She had sat in the plastic chair across the vice principal's desk and listened to the whole thing without expression. She had no evidence to contradict it. She had no witness who had been present. The complaint had been designed around the absence of witnesses. 2 days later, the rent increase notice arrived. Not a conversation, a letter, official, with a law firm's letterhead and a notary stamp and language of the specific density that made ordinary people feel that fighting it was futile. The night before the alley, Kezia went to the building's storage room to retrieve a textbook she had left in her bicycle basket. In the bicycle's rear tire had been flattened. Not from wear, the valve had been deliberately turned. Tucked under the back wheel was a folded piece of paper. 4 words on it, no signature. She read it once. She folded it and put it in her jacket pocket and pushed the bicycle home in the dark. On her way through the lobby, she passed Marcus Holt's office window. The light was on. He was on the phone, half turned from the glass. Relaxed, the particular ease of a man who had always operated without consequences and saw no reason for that to change. She watched him through the glass for 3 seconds. Then she walked upstairs and measured out her grandmother's evening medication and sat at the kitchen table with the textbook she needed and the piece of paper folded in her pocket and the rent notice folded in the drawer, and thought about leverage. In the alley, Kezia moved from the entrance with her eyes running the calculation that 9 years of training had made automatic. 1 person down, 3 standing. The one at the center, tallest, the one the other 2 kept orienting toward, was giving direction. He would respond first. His 2 associates were positioned to the right and left, not yet engaged with her, still focused on the man on the ground. The man on the ground was an older black man, gray at his temples, a good coat now badly torn, one hand still moving slightly against the concrete, flexing and releasing, still conscious. She's still time. The center attacker heard her footsteps and turned. He was large, well over 6 feet, heavy set, the kind of physical presence that had probably been solving problems through intimidation for years. He took her in the way people take in things they have assessed and dismissed before they have fully processed. A teenage girl in a school uniform, earbuds, maybe 110 pounds. His expression moved almost into something like amusement. The one on her right moved first, shifting to cut off the alley exit behind her. The one on her left followed, forming a half circle. The center one took 3 steps toward her, slow, deliberate, not aggressive yet. The movement of someone managing an inconvenience. He reached out one hand toward her shoulder, the dismissive gesture, the one that says, "You are not a factor." That was the precise moment she moved. She didn't step back. She stepped forward inside the arc of his arm, into the gap his reaching motion had opened in his own balance. Her right hand closed around his wrist. Her left hand went to his far shoulder. Her hip swung across and behind his hip, and she dropped her weight in a single compact movement that took less than a second and used nothing but physics. 240 pounds of man left the ground. He came down on his back on the alley floor with a sound that cracked off both brick walls simultaneously. a sound so absolute and complete that the other two men froze in place as if the impact had traveled through the concrete into their feet. The silence lasted perhaps 2 seconds. From a second-floor window of the building that backed against the alley, a 16-year-old named Deshaun Harris had been leaning out getting air when he heard the first sounds of the assault. He had grabbed his phone. He had not gone downstairs. He was 16, and he did not know what to do, and his body had made the decision to stay. He had been recording for 90 seconds before Kezia walked in. He kept recording. The center attacker was on the ground, conscious but emptied. The throw had taken every organized thought out of him. Kezia stood where she had completed the motion, hands at her sides, weight balanced, breathing normally. She looked at the two remaining men. Her expression was not anger and not fear. Coach Briggs had a word for it: readiness. The expression of someone who has done the preparation and is simply present in the moment the preparation was for. One of the two men ran. The other stood looking at the one on the ground for another second, then ran. Their footsteps echoed and disappeared. Kezia walked to where the older man lay. She crouched and placed 2 fingers on his wrist, found his pulse. Present, weak, irregular. She said, "My name is Kezia. I've already called 911. Help is coming. Please don't try to move." She said it in the tone Coach Briggs had taught her. Not the tone of someone asking. The tone of someone who knows exactly where they are and what the situation requires. Franklin Wells opened his eyes. He looked at the face above him. A child in a school uniform with a blue hair tie and earbuds still hanging from her collar, crouched in a dark alley in the cold, telling him with complete composure to stay still. He stayed still. The sirens came 2 minutes later. Before they arrived, thus Kezia stood, moved to the alley entrance, and positioned herself where the responding officers would see her first. She put her hands where they could be seen. She had thought about this moment. Coach Briggs had been specific about it, had made her think about it in detail, the reality of what a responding officer would see when they turned into that alley. A black teenager, a large man on the ground, an older man injured nearby. She knew which story would be the easiest story. She had prepared to interrupt it. When the first officer appeared, she said, "My name is Kezia Drummond. I'm 13. I live at 412 Harrington, 3 blocks east. I called 911 before I entered this alley. There was an assault in progress against an elderly man. I intervened using physical force against one of 3 attackers. The other 2 fled on foot, both heading north. The man who is still present is not conscious of his surroundings." She had rehearsed nothing. It came out clear because she had been thinking about what was true and how to say it. Deshaun Harris posted the video at 10:18 p.m. without editing it, without adding a title, with only a caption. "Girl just flipped a grown man twice her size in the alley on Crane. He was beating someone. She walked in by herself. I watched the whole thing. Nobody's going to believe this." By midnight, it had 800,000 views. By 6 the next morning, it had passed 3 million. By the time Kezia woke up and measured out Estelle's morning medication, her name was being spoken on national morning news programs. She watched 4 minutes of coverage. Then she turned the television off and walked to school. And Marcus Holt was on the phone before the ambulance had cleared the block. He had a contact, a former colleague from a property dispute in 2019, who now worked adjacent to several local media platforms. And he used him the way he used all information, as a tool, precisely applied. The call lasted 6 minutes. By the time it ended, he had planted 3 things: the behavioral complaint in Kezia's school file, the fact that she regularly walked through that alley late in the evening, and the suggestion, never stated directly, simply arranged, of a connection between her family's lease situation and the building where Franklin Wells held a property interest. He did not say she was guilty. He didn't have to. He knew how narrative worked. You assembled pieces and let other people's pattern recognition do the construction. By 7 the next morning, 2 platforms had published pieces with questions in their headlines. Teen hero, or something more complicated? What was a 13-year-old doing alone in an alley after dark? The comment sections were exactly what he had anticipated. For every person calling her extraordinary, there was another one asking questions that had been designed to be asked. Kezia's school placed her on indefinite suspension at 9 a.m., pending an inquiry into the behavioral complaint in her file. The notice was delivered to Estelle by phone while Kezia was already in the building because the suspension had been decided before Kezia arrived. Nobody told her directly. She found out when she was turned away at the classroom door. She sat on the front steps of the school for 20 minutes. Then she walked to the community center. Eddie Coach Briggs was already in the training room when she arrived. He looked at her face and didn't ask anything immediately. He just nodded toward the mat. She trained for 45 minutes with an intensity that was not anger. It was the other thing, the thing on the other side of anger, quieter and more total. When she stopped, he sat on the bench beside her. He said, "The story doesn't get to end with their version of events." She looked at him. Why not? Because the footage exists. Because the 911 call exists. Because you didn't run. He looked at her steadily. Because I have been watching you in this room for 9 years, and what you did last night was exactly what I taught you to do. And no one who looks at the evidence honestly will be able to say otherwise. He paused. The question is, who does the looking? The question had an answer. Why, though Kezia didn't know it yet. Franklin Wells had been watching the clip from his hospital bed. He had been admitted for 2 cracked ribs, a concussion, and extensive bruising, and had watched it 11 times when his assistant appeared in the doorway to tell him that the legal team connected to Moore's property management company had reached out to suggest a meeting regarding their mutual interests. He looked at his assistant over the tablet in his hands. He was watching the throw again, the pure geometric perfection of it. The single second where a 240-pound man left the ground because a 13-year-old girl had understood angles better than he did. "Get me Diane Okafor," he said. His assistant, who had worked for him for 12 years and was accustomed to instructions that arrived from unexpected directions, said, "The civil rights attorney?" Yes. Diane Okafor was 62 and had been practicing civil rights law in Detroit for 34 years. She had a modest office, a list of clients whose cases she had taken at no charge because the cases were right and the clients couldn't afford anything else, and a reputation in the city's legal community as someone who took cases other people considered unwinnable and won them by doing more preparation than anyone else. She agreed to take Kezia's case before Wells had finished explaining the situation. She reviewed the materials that afternoon, organized them chronologically, and identified a pattern in 30 minutes that she had seen versions of before. Every element of pressure on Kezia, the school complaint, the rent increase, the note, were the media framing, traced to a 72-hour window following a single trigger. The day Marcus Holt had discovered that Franklin Wells was connected to the Nyack Community Center. She pulled the thread. The attacker who had been arrested at the scene, he had been unable to run due to the fall's impact, had a prior record and a lawyer who was already discussing terms with the prosecution. Diane Okafor contacted the prosecutor's office and asked one question. How did 3 men know the specific route, the specific time, and the specific evening that Franklin Wells would be walking alone? The prosecution didn't have an answer. That absence was the answer. 3 days later, the arrested attacker agreed to cooperate. His conditions were modest. What he provided in return was specific. 2 phone calls described in detail, surrounding a voice he identified, a purpose he had been given, and the name of a private LLC through which a finder's fee was supposed to have cleared had the assault achieved its objective. Diane Okafor wrote the name at the center of the LLC on a yellow legal pad. She recognized the organizational structure. She had seen it before, in a different context, in a different case. She pulled that file from her cabinet and sat with both files open and looked at the pattern between them. She called a detective she had worked with on 3 prior cases and asked him to look at the purchase records for a specific prepaid phone number. The number had been used to contact the attacker 4 times in the 36 hours before the assault. When the purchase had been made at a convenience store 200 meters from a specific building management office on Harrington, the store had an exterior camera. The footage was identifiable. The deposition was held 12 days after the alley, on the 14th floor of a building downtown with floor-to-ceiling windows and air conditioning set to a temperature that made everyone keep their coats on. Marcus Holt arrived with 2 attorneys and an expression he had perfected over 30 years of property disputes. Controlled, slightly bored, the expression of a man who had sat in rooms like this before and walked out without consequence every time. He had reasons for confidence: the school file, the media coverage he had seeded, the written statement from the tenant who had filed the behavioral complaint. 11 years of management records with no successful action against him. Kezia sat to Diane Okafor's left in a pressed white blouse with her hair tied back neatly. She had her hands flat on the table in front of her. She looked younger than 13 and older than 13 simultaneously, in the way that children do who have spent years navigating situations designed for adults. Diane Okafor opened her folder and placed the first document on the table. It was a frame capture from Deshaun Harris's full footage, the version that was 51 seconds longer than the clip he had uploaded publicly, which included a visible timestamp in the corner. The timestamp showed that Franklin Wells had been on the ground in that alley for 47 seconds before Kezia entered from the northern entrance. She had not been there before the assault, or she had not known it was coming. She had encountered it and responded. The first pillar of Marcus Holt's narrative cracked. Diane placed the second document: call records from the prepaid phone, 4 contacts to the arrested attacker in a 36-hour window, the store camera screenshot, the timestamp, the jacket with the distinctive shoulder detail. Marcus Holt's lead attorney leaned over and said something quietly in his ear. Holt's expression did not change. His right hand, which had been resting on the table, moved to his lap. The second pillar cracked. The cooperation statement was the third document. It named Marcus Holt by name. It described the calls in detail. It described the purpose: targeted physical intimidation designed to coerce a property transaction signature. It described the LLC and the finder's fee structure. It described what the attacker had been told the goal was. This had never been a robbery. It had been orchestrated violence for financial gain, constructed by a man who had spent 3 decades believing himself untouchable, organized around the assumption that no one would look carefully enough to see the architecture underneath. The third pillar came down. The hearing officer asked Kezia to explain in her own words why she had entered the alley rather than waiting outside for emergency services. She looked at the hearing officer directly. She said, "I had already called 911 before I went in. I stood at the entrance for several seconds. I was going to wait." She paused, and the pause was not for effect. It was because she was choosing words accurately. The sound he was making, the way he was breathing. I'd heard that sound once before. My grandmother made that sound in a hospital hallway last winter when her heart had an episode. It's a specific sound. She stopped for a moment. When I heard it, I couldn't make myself wait. I had a way to stop what was happening to him, and I used the minimum of it. Then I stayed. No one in the room moved for several seconds. It was that last sentence that did the most. Not the legal reasoning. The legal reasoning was sound, and Diane Okafor had built the case around it carefully. But it was the last sentence, the simplest one, that made something shift in the room. Then I stayed. 3 words. The difference between a child who had panicked and run and a child who had understood in the middle of a dark alley that staying was the thing, that the action was not only the throw, it was everything that came after. The 911 call before she entered, the crouching beside the man, the pulse check, the voice keeping him calm, and then standing in the light where the officers would see her, hands visible, name ready, facts organized. She had been 13 years old in a dark alley at 9:47 at night, and she had done every single thing correctly. Not out of training alone. Training had given her the physical tools. What she had done with the rest of it came from something else, from 9 years of paying attention, from 5 o'clock mornings, from the specific kind of intelligence that develops in a person who has spent their entire life thinking 3 steps ahead because the cost of not doing so was always immediate and real. Marcus Holt's junior attorney was looking at the table. His senior attorney was looking at the window. Diane Okafor said nothing. She didn't need to. The testimony had done the one thing that legal argument cannot reliably do. It had made the truth of the situation undeniable, not as a matter of law, but as a matter of basic human recognition. A child had heard a sound that frightened her because it sounded like her grandmother dying. She had acted with more precision and more restraint than most trained adults would have managed. She had saved a man's life. She had not run. The formal ruling came 9 days later. All proceedings against Kezia Drummond were dismissed in full. The school behavioral complaint was stricken from her record, flagged as unsubstantiated, and a written acknowledgement from the district confirmed that her suspension had been imposed without adequate justification. Her record was clean. In the ruling on her actions in the alley used language that was quoted in 17 news outlets in the week that followed. The use of physical force was proportional, precise, and consistent with the legal standard for defense of a third party under imminent threat of serious bodily harm. The level of restraint demonstrated, a single technique applied to one individual, resulting in no lasting injury, with immediate cessation of force once the threat was neutralized, was consistent with the conduct of a trained professional responder. She was 13 years old. Marcus Holt was arrested at his building management office on a Tuesday morning. The charges were conspiracy to commit aggravated assault and wire fraud in connection with an attempt to coerce a property transaction through physical intimidation. The fraud investigation, as it expanded, opened secondary inquiries into 6 additional transactions connected to the same LLC structure across 4 Detroit districts. The tenants of his building began calling the city housing authority the morning his arrest was reported. The calls came for 4 days. Complaints that had been held for years by people who knew what filing cost came in now with dates and documentation and names. The eviction notice against Estelle Drummond had been formally withdrawn by the newly appointed building management the day before Holt's arrest. The outstanding balance, 14 months of fees and accumulated charges, had been cleared by a payment from a private account. No note accompanied it. Estelle called the management office twice to confirm it was real. Then she sat down at her kitchen table and folded her hands and said, quietly to no one in particular, somebody was watching. Diane Okafor called Kezia at 11:20 in the morning. Kezia was in the training room at the community center when the call came. She walked into the hallway to take it. Everything dismissed, Diane said. Your record is clean. Completely. A brief silence. Okay, Kezia said. Thank you, Ms. Okafor. Thank you for not running. Kezia hung up. She stood in the hallway for a moment. Then she walked back into the training room and told Coach Briggs. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, I know. He had been watching the news feed on his phone between sessions all morning. She pulled her hair tie out, redid it, pulled it tight. Can we work on the follow-through on that entry? I think I was a half step too wide. Coach Briggs looked at her for another moment. Then, yeah, let's work on it. To Franklin Wells held a press conference 8 days after his discharge. He declined the prepared statement his communications team had written and spoke from notes for 7 minutes. He announced 2 things. The first, all residential properties in which Wells Holdings held a direct or indirect ownership interest within Detroit's East Side districts would be subject to an immediate 5-year rent freeze, with an independent tenant review board empowered to evaluate any proposed increase after the freeze period expired. The second, the Naya Community Center on Mack Avenue would receive funding sufficient to construct and operate a new dedicated facility wing. The wing would house a free program for all Detroit youth under 18. No application, no income threshold. Any young person who walked through the door. As he had been going to name the program something formal and institutional. His assistant had suggested something with his own name, or with the center's name. He had thought about it for 3 days and then decided. It will be called the One Move Program, he said from the podium. He let that sit for a moment, because one move applied correctly at the right moment is often all it takes, and most people never learn they have it available to them. After the room emptied and only a few people remained in the back, he moved through the space to where Kezia was standing against the wall. She had been there for the entire press conference. She had not come forward when he finished speaking. She had waited, the quality of patience that was not passive but simply calibrated, knowing when the moment was hers and when it wasn't. He stopped in front of her. Thank you, he said. She looked at him directly. Don't waste it. He held her gaze. He nodded once. She nodded back. The program opened on a Saturday morning in March in the new wing, which smelled like fresh flooring and new paint and the specific nervous energy of a room where something is beginning. 19 students were in 2 rows when the session started. Mostly girls, mostly between 11 and 16. mostly from within a half-mile radius of the building. Several had watched the video clip multiple times before registering. One of them, 12 years old, had watched it 26 times. She had told her mother on the third viewing, "I want to know how to do that." Her mother had signed the form the same day. Her coach Briggs stood in the doorway of the new wing with his arms crossed and watched the room fill with an expression that he did not allow himself to display often, and that anyone who had watched him over 11 years of running this program in a converted storage room would have recognized immediately. The expression of a man who had believed something without evidence for a very long time and was watching the evidence arrive. At the front of the room, standing with her feet shoulder-width apart and her hands easy at her sides, was Kezia Drummond. Still 13. She would turn 14 in 2 months. She was wearing the training clothes she had worn for most of her life. Fabric softened from hundreds of washes, knees slightly worn, blue hair tie. So she looked at the 2 rows of students in front of her, the way Coach Briggs had always looked at a new group. Reading the room, noting who was carrying something they hadn't named, noting who was covering something with bravado, noting who was genuinely ready and didn't know it yet. She had been all of them. She recognized each one without judgment. She waited until the room was completely quiet. Then she said, "The most important thing you're going to learn here is not a specific technique. It's that you have the right to protect yourself and the right to protect the people around you when you're the one who can. Everything else builds from that. Once you know the right belongs to you, the rest follows." She let that land. Then, let's start. Franklin Wells arrived 20 minutes into the first session through a side entrance. He stood near the back wall, out of the way, and watched for 40 minutes. He watched Kezia move from student to student with the focused, unhurried precision of someone who had fully inhabited their own knowledge, not performing expertise, simply using it. He watched her stop beside a small girl who was holding her weight too far back on her heels, place both hands on the girl's shoulders, shift her forward a half inch. "There," Kezia said. "That's your ground. Everything starts from there." The girl adjusted, tried the movement. The difference was immediate. You could see it in her face. The moment the body understands something, the mind has just been told. Wells watched from the back of the room. Before he left, he paused beside Coach Briggs in the doorway. "Is she going to be all right?" he asked. Coach Briggs looked at Kezia at the front of the room, moving, teaching, adjusting, completely in her element. "She was always going to be all right," he said. The world just kept getting in her way. Estelle Drummond was in the chairs along the wall, her hands folded in her lap. She watched her granddaughter the way grandmothers watch children they have raised in hard circumstances become themselves, with an expression that contains everything: the mornings, the medication, the rent notices, the years of getting up at 5, the weight of carrying what should not have been a child's to carry, and underneath all of that, further down, the thing that had always been there even in the worst of it. Pride so deep it had no bottom. Outside, the Detroit winter was still doing what Detroit winters do in March. Relentless, gray, indifferent to the human events occurring inside its borders. The city went on. The neighborhood went on. The corner stores and the church murals and the families who knew each other's business went on. And in a new room that smelled like fresh flooring and beginning, a 13-year-old girl with a blue hair tie was teaching 19 students that the right to protect themselves had always belonged to them, that it had never required anyone's permission, that one move at the right moment from the right position was sometimes the only thing between everything and nothing. She had always known that. The world was finally catching up.